My name is Captain Talia Barnes. I'm 28 years old, and in 3 days, I'm supposed to marry the love of my life, Julian Vance. Everything was perfect until I was ambushed in my own future home. My mother-in-law-to-be, Genevieve Vance, glanced at the uniform I wear with honor and delivered a bone-chilling remark. "Let's be realistic, dear. Your military pension won't even cover the property taxes here." His father then slid over a humiliating prenuptial agreement with a cold ultimatum. Sign it, or the wedding is off. What they don't know is that behind my modest salary is a $9 million net worth. Their smug faces are about to confront the only thing they respect. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe that honor can't be bought, hit that like button and subscribe to join me on my mission to wipe those smirks clean off their faces. The air in the Hamptons always feels different, heavy with the scent of salt and money. As I drove through the towering hedges that guarded the Vance estate, I felt like I was crossing into a foreign territory, one where my rules of engagement didn't apply. My dress blues, the uniform I had earned the right to wear through years of discipline and dedication at West Point, suddenly felt like a costume. I was escorted not into a living room, but into a chamber that felt more like a museum exhibit dedicated to the history of wealth. The air was thick with the smell of polished mahogany and the funereal scent of white lilies, so overpowering it was hard to breathe. Genevieve Vance rose from a silk-upholstered settee, a smile perfectly arranged on her face. But it was a masterpiece of social camouflage. It never reached her cold, calculating eyes. "Talia, dear, do sit," she said, her voice smooth as glass. She gestured not with her hand, but with a flick of her chin towards a delicate Louis XIII armchair. The chair looked like it would shatter under the weight of a stiff breeze, let alone a soldier. Sitting down, the crisp fabric of my uniform seemed to protest against the antique brocade. Alistair Vance remained seated opposite me, silent and solid as a granite statue. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply watched me, his lawyer's eyes conducting a swift, brutal appraisal as if valuing an asset he was considering acquiring or liquidating. There were no pleasantries, no questions about my flight from North Carolina, no small talk about the wedding preparations. The silence was a statement. I wasn't here as a future daughter. I was a problem to be solved. A sterling silver tea service sat on the table between us. A single cup of Earl Grey poured for me. I never touched it. I watched as the steam rising from the porcelain thinned and then vanished completely, the tea growing as cold as the atmosphere in the room. Genevieve let the silence stretch, a tactic I recognized. Let the adversary grow uncomfortable. Let them make the first mistake. Finally, she broke it. "Julian is so very fond of you," she began, the words dripping with condescension. "But we, as his parents, have a duty to consider the practicalities." She leaned forward slightly. "Let's be realistic, dear. Your military pension won't even cover the property taxes here." The words landed like a precision strike. It was shocking in its directness, its utter lack of grace. But it was only the opening salvo. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, drifted down to the decorations on my chest. The ribbons and medals that told the story of my service, of deployments, of excellence under pressure. "And these are just..." "Darling," she cooed, the way one might speak of a child's macaroni art project. "You must be very proud. But in our world, Talia, legacy is measured in trust fund statements, not in little pieces of metal." It wasn't just an insult, it was a desecration. In that moment, she took every pre-dawn ruck march, every sleepless night studying strategy, every moment of gut-wrenching fear I'd ever faced, and she tossed it all into a trash can like it was worthless. To her, my service to the country, the very foundation of my identity, was nothing more than a blue-collar job, a quaint but ultimately insignificant hobby. I felt a cold wave of anguish wash over me, but my training locked it down tight. I kept my back straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. That was Alistair's cue. With a quiet scraping sound, he slid a thick, leather-bound document across the gleaming mahogany table. It stopped inches from my hand. "Don't take this personally," he said, his voice a low rumble. It's simply business. I picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive. I began to flip through the pages, my mind shifting from defense to analysis. It was worse than I could have imagined. This wasn't a prenuptial agreement, it was a document of unconditional surrender. Clause 7b stipulated that any inheritance I received during the marriage would be absorbed directly into the Vance family trust. Clause 12a granted them oversight, a veto, essentially, on my personal investment decisions. It was an annexation, designed to turn me into a wholly owned subsidiary of the Vance Corporation. I looked up, keeping my voice steady and professional. This is a complex document. I'll need to have my attorney review it. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped Alistair's lips. My dear girl, he said, the condescension now thick enough to cut with a knife. I am the attorney. And I'm telling you, this is a generous deal. It allows you to step into a life you could never have even dreamed of. He leaned back, steepling his fingers under his chin, the picture of absolute power. So, here's the offer. Sign the document, or you can walk out that door and call off the wedding, he concluded, his voice dropping to a flat, dismissive tone. Julian will be disappointed, of course, but he'll get over it. He knows where his loyalties lie. They thought they had me. Cornered, outgunned, and emotionally compromised. They expected tears, pleading, a desperate phone call to Julian. They had prepared for a heartbroken girl, but they were facing an intelligence officer who had just been handed the enemy's entire battle plan. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet. The silence in the room was absolute, charged with their expectation. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up the leather-bound contract. I'll be keeping this, I said. My voice wasn't angry, it wasn't tearful. It was level, final. Their faces registered a flicker of confusion. This wasn't in their script. They had prepared for an emotional surrender, not this cold, steel-enforced silence. As I turned and walked toward the grand double doors, I could feel their eyes on my back, their sense of victory now tainted with a sliver of bewildered uncertainty. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, and I stood for a moment in the marble foyer, taking my first free breath. The game was on. They had shown their hand. Now, what was my plan of attack? I drove away from the Vance estate in a state of controlled silence, the leather-bound contract sitting on the passenger seat like a block of ice, radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The calculated cruelty of their ambush still echoed in my ears, but beneath the shock, a cold, hard anger was beginning to solidify. My first instinct wasn't to call Julian. It wasn't to find a hotel and lick my wounds. It was to retreat to solid ground, to my home base. I didn't drive back to the temporary apartment Julian had arranged for me in the city. Instead, I pointed the car toward LaGuardia Airport, my movements precise and automatic. Inside the terminal, I walked straight to a kiosk and bought a one-way ticket for the first available flight to Fayetteville, North Carolina. I needed to go home. I needed to be in a place where things made sense, where honor wasn't just a quaint word people used before talking about money. Hours later, as the plane descended, the sterile, recycled air of the cabin gave way to the familiar, humid warmth of home. When I stepped off the jet bridge, the thick, pine-scented North Carolina air wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. This was real. Driving through the familiar streets of the town that bordered Fort Bragg, I saw them everywhere. American flags hanging proudly from front porches, yellow ribbons tied around old oak trees. This was a world a million miles away from the cold marble and polished mahogany of the Hamptons, not just in distance, but in soul. I let myself into my parents' quiet, modest house. It smelled of coffee and cedar, the comforting scent of my entire childhood. In the study, I went straight to the bookshelf and pulled down my grandfather's old wooden footlocker. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was his distinguished service cross. I lifted it from its box, the metal cool and heavy in my palm. It felt substantial. It felt earned. Holding it, I could almost hear his voice, a low, steady baritone that always made you feel safe. I remembered the long summer afternoons he spent teaching me chess on the porch, the scent of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. "Talia," he'd say, moving a knight with his worn, steady hand. Every piece on this board has its own value, from the pawn to the queen. But the game is won by the player who knows how to use them. Don't you ever let someone else tell you what you're worth. He was a decorated army colonel from the Second World War, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and emerged with his integrity intact. But he was also a quiet, shrewd investor, a man who had studied the stock market with the same intensity he had studied battlefield maps. He'd built a fortune not for the sake of luxury or status, but for one single, non-negotiable purpose: to ensure that his children and his children's children would never have to bow their heads to anyone for money. He never talked about it. The wealth wasn't the point. It was a tool. It wasn't money. It was freedom. Then I thought of my father. I remembered the day my acceptance letter from West Point arrived. My dad, a retired sergeant first class who had spent 20 years in the 82nd Airborne, didn't pop a bottle of champagne or throw a party. He just nodded, a slow, proud smile creasing the corners of his eyes. Then he led me out to the backyard, handed me an axe, and pointed to a pile of logs. "You want to be an officer? Good," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Then you're going to split this wood. A soldier has to know how to take care of herself before she can lead others." So I spent the rest of that day splitting firewood, my hands blistering, sweat stinging my eyes. That was how my family showed love. Not with empty platitudes or expensive gifts, but by forging us, by teaching us resilience. They gave us the tools to be unbreakable. Genevieve Vance thought she was insulting me with money. She couldn't have been more wrong. She wasn't attacking my bank account. She was attacking the very bedrock of my existence, the foundation built by 3 generations of the Barnes family: honor, service, and a self-respect that could not be bought, sold, or negotiated. Back in my father's study, I cleared a space on his old oak desk. On one side, I placed the Vance's insulting contract, its polished leather cover gleaming under the desk lamp. On the other side, I placed my grandfather's Distinguished Service Cross. 2 worlds, 2 value systems locked in a silent confrontation. I looked at the framed, black-and-white photograph on the wall. It was my grandfather as a young man in his WW-73 uniform, his gaze clear and resolute, looking out at a future he was fighting for. I knew exactly what he would say if he were here. He wouldn't tell me to be polite or to compromise. He would quote Patton, just as he always did. "Measure a man not by where he stands in moments of comfort, but by where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." He'd tell me to assess the terrain, gather my forces, and fight. A quiet promise formed in my heart. "I won't let you down, Grandpa," I whispered to the photograph. The path forward was suddenly clear. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was a tactical operation, and every good operation needs the right assets. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, past names of colonels and fellow captains, until I found the one I was looking for: Marcus Thorne, a name as solid and dependable as the man himself. Retired JAG Corps Colonel. My grandfather's personal attorney. The one man on earth who understood the language of both the U.S. military code and corporate law. I pressed the call button. It was time to bring in the artillery. Back in my father's study, the comforting presence of my family's history did little to quiet the storm brewing inside me. The books on military strategy lining the walls, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, battle analyses from Normandy to Fallujah, all spoke of tactics and logistics, but none offered a protocol for a betrayal of the heart. My phone had remained silent for hours, a dead weight on the old oak desk. Julian knew I had met with his parents. His silence was a confession, louder and more damning than any words he could have spoken. Every minute that ticked by felt like a small crack appearing in the foundation of what we were building. I had faced enemy fire, but this felt different. This was a battle I was supposed to be fighting with an ally by my side. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I had to know. I was the one who made the call. He picked up on the first ring, his voice hesitant, laced with a guilt he couldn't hide. "Talia, I was just about to call you." I refused to engage with the flimsy excuse. I sat up straighter in my grandfather's worn leather chair, my voice coming out colder and steadier than I felt. You knew about it, didn't you, Julian? I asked, dispensing with any preamble. The question was a clean, surgical strike. The silence on the other end of the line was my answer. It stretched for 3, maybe 4 seconds, an eternity filled with everything he wasn't saying. Finally, a weak exhale. Talia, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop them, I really did. How did you try, Julian? I cut him off, the coldness in my voice sharpening to a razor's edge. By letting me walk into that ambush alone. In the army, we have a name for that. It's called abandoning your partner under enemy fire. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain. The explanation was a cascade of tired, predictable excuses. Family tradition, he said. The pressure they put on me, they just want what's best. It all sounded like nonsense, the meaningless justifications of a man who had chosen the path of least resistance. Julian, did you read the contract? I pressed, my voice low and controlled. Did you read the clause that says I would have no legal claim to the home we live in, that I would have to surrender control over my own assets? Did you read that part? He stammered. I thought it was just a formality, a standard thing. No, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. It is not a formality, it's a manifesto. It declares that I am not trustworthy, that I am an outsider, that I am not your equal. Do you agree with that manifesto, Julian? He had no answer. There was no answer. After a few more moments of his agonizing silence, I ended the call. The phone clattered onto the desk, and a profound, terrifying emptiness washed over me. For the first time, I felt utterly alone in this fight. My fingers, moving on autopilot, dialed my best friend, Maya Ray Reyes. She was a combat helicopter pilot, currently stationed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. But she picked up instantly, her voice a welcome shot of caffeine and common sense. Barnes, what's wrong? You sound like you just got your butt handed to you in a war game. I told her everything. The mahogany room, the condescending smiles, the contract, and the gut-wrenching phone call with Julian. When I finished, Maya didn't offer any soft, useless platitudes. She was a pilot. She saw things in terms of threats, targets, and mission objectives. Talia, listen to me, she said, her voice sharp and clear over the thousands of miles of ocean. This is a PSYOPs campaign. Standard divide and conquer. They're trying to isolate you, break your morale, don't let them. But this Julian guy, he has to prove his loyalty. On my crew, if someone hesitates under fire, they don't just endanger themselves, they endanger the entire mission. They get everyone killed. Her words were like a splash of ice water to the face, shocking me out of the emotional fog. She was right. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings. This was a strategic assessment of a life partner, my co-pilot. I took a deep, steadying breath, my resolve hardening into something cold and clear. My training took over, pushing the pain aside, focusing only on the objective. Trust, but verify. It was time to verify Julian's allegiance. I picked up my phone again. This time, I sent a short, unambiguous text message. I don't need an apology. I need a decision. Where does your loyalty lie? With your family's legacy or with our future? You have 24 hours to decide which side you're fighting on. I set the phone down on the desk, face down. I had done what a commander has to do, draw a clear line in the sand and demand an unequivocal commitment. The ball was in his court now. Before I tell you what happened next, I have to ask you something. If you've ever felt like you were fighting a battle all alone, when the one person who was supposed to have your back went silent, then please hit that like button so I know I'm not the only one. And in the comments, just type a simple, I stand with you. It means more than you know. Now, while I waited for his answer, I would prepare for war, whether I had to fight it alone or with him by my side. One battle was on hold, but the other was just beginning. Next step, the meeting with Marcus Thorne. The next morning, I drove into downtown Charlotte, the uncertainty about Julian a heavy weight in my gut. But I compartmentalized it, one mission at a time. My current objective was to secure legal counsel, and there was only one man for the job. Marcus Thorne's law office wasn't in one of the city's gleaming new skyscrapers. It occupied the top floor of a solid, old brick building with a sense of permanence. The elevator opened into a space that felt more like a command post than a law firm. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with law books, their spines worn from use. There were no abstract paintings, only framed maps of historical battles and a folded American flag encased in a triangular shadow box, the kind given to the families of fallen soldiers. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the strong black coffee that was perpetually brewing. This was his fortress. Marcus Thorne stood to greet me from behind a massive oak desk. He was in his 70s, but he carried himself with the ramrod straight posture of a man who had spent a lifetime in uniform. His handshake was firm, his grip strong, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see right through any pretense. "Captain Barnes," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "your father told me you were the sharpest one in the family. Word is you're having a little trouble with some white shoe lawyers up in New York." There was no small talk, just a direct line to the heart of the matter. It was a relief. I placed the Vance's leather-bound contract on his desk. It looked alien and obscene in this room dedicated to justice and honor. He put on a pair of reading glasses, his expression unreadable as he scanned the first few pages. He flipped through the document with an unnerving speed, his sharp eyes missing nothing. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, and let out a short, sharp snort of utter contempt. "This isn't a contract, Captain," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is an unconditional surrender document. It's a cowardly piece of work." Hearing him say that, hearing him validate the outrage I felt, was like a balm on a raw wound. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. "They think I have nothing to lose," I said, my voice steady, "and nothing worth protecting. They're wrong on both counts." I slid another folder across the desk, a simple manila folder containing the notarized statements of my financial portfolio. Marcus picked it up, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He opened it and began to read. I watched his face. I saw him scan the assets, the diversified stocks, the real estate holdings. I saw the moment his eyes landed on the final page, on the bottom line number. One of his silver eyebrows shot up. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips, the smile of a predator who has just spotted a fatal weakness in his opponent. He placed the folder down gently, deliberately, and looked at me, not as his old friend's granddaughter, but as a fellow warrior. His eyes held a new and profound respect. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping low, "this changes the entire strategic landscape. This isn't defense, Captain. This is overwhelming firepower. We're not just going to reject their insulting offer, we are going to shove it right back down their throats." The relief that flooded through me was immense. The loneliness and uncertainty that had plagued me for the last 24 hours evaporated. I was no longer an isolated soldier behind enemy lines. I had an ally, a general. For the next 2 hours, we weren't a lawyer and his client. We were 2 military officers in a command tent, planning a campaign. We whiteboarded the entire operation, analyzing the enemy's strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses, their arrogance, their obsession with appearances, their mortal fear of public scandal. We defined our strategic objective, not to annihilate, but to compel, to force them to the negotiating table and secure a treaty based on mutual respect, not domination. "We are not playing their game by their rules, Talia," Marcus said, tapping a pen on the desk like a drumbeat. "We are creating a new battlefield, one where their money and status mean nothing. We're going to draft our own prenup, a document that isn't about protecting assets, but about protecting honor." He got it. He understood instantly that this was never about the money. It was about the principle. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to sketch out the framework. We didn't call it a prenuptial agreement. We called it the Articles of an Equal Partnership. It didn't begin with a cold list of assets. It began with a preamble, a declaration of principles, mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and a commitment to support one another's careers and callings. It shielded my inheritance with ironclad language, but it was also fair to Julian, protecting his own future contributions. It transformed a cold legal document into a statement of values. It was our Declaration of Independence. When Alistair Vance reads this, Marcus said with a grin of pure, predatory satisfaction, he's going to realize he's not dealing with some naive little soldier girl. He's going to realize he's dealing with the granddaughter of one of the smartest, toughest men I ever had the honor of serving with. He capped his pen and pushed the legal pad towards me. The foundation of our counteroffensive was complete. Now, he said, his voice softening just a fraction, you go home, and you wait to see if your young soldier passes his test. The 24-hour deadline I had given Julian stretched into an agonizing silence. With every hour that passed, the hope I clung to frayed a little more. I had my meeting with Marcus Thorne. I had a plan of attack. But the question of whether I would be executing it alone hung in the air like a storm cloud. I tried to focus, to read, to do anything to keep my mind off the ticking clock. But it was no use. This wasn't a tactical problem I could solve with logic. It was a matter of the heart. 23 hours after I sent the text, just as I was beginning to accept the bitter reality that I had lost him, I heard a knock at the front door. Not a loud, demanding knock, but a soft, hesitant one. My breath caught in my throat. I walked slowly to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Looking through the peephole, I saw him. It was Julian. He was just standing there on the porch, looking exhausted. His hair was a mess, his clothes were rumpled, and he held a small carry-on bag in one hand. He hadn't just driven from the city, he had flown here. That single decisive action spoke volumes more than 1,000 texted apologies. A fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in my chest. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. He didn't try to rush in, he didn't try to hug me or offer a desperate excuse. He just stood there, his eyes meeting mine. And in their depths, I saw profound, soul-deep regret. You were right, he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue and emotion. You told me I had to pick a side, and I have. I'm here, Talia. I'm on your side. I stepped back and let him in, my own voice failing me. We didn't speak as he set his bag down. We just moved into the simple, comfortable living room of my parents' house, a universe away from the cold, mahogany-paneled room where my ordeal had begun. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy with everything that needed to be said. He finally broke it, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken inside him. He told me everything. After our call, he had driven straight to the Hamptons and confronted his parents. He told them their contract was a disgrace, an insult to the woman he loved. He told them that if they forced the issue, he would be the one to call off the wedding, and he would make sure the whole world knew exactly why. He described the fallout. His father's explosive anger, his mother's theatrical tears. They had accused me of manipulating him, of poisoning him against his own family. For the first time in my life, Talia, Julian said, his eyes welling up with unshed tears. I looked at them, and I didn't recognize them. They weren't concerned about my happiness. They were concerned about control. You saw who they really are, and I'm so sorry I was blind for so long. He had finally seen the truth, and in that moment, seeing the pain and the clarity in his eyes, I knew the fracture between us could be healed. The trust that had been shattered was beginning to piece itself back together. It was my turn to be completely honest, to close the final gap between us. I reached for the manila folder Marcus had reviewed, my financial statements, and placed it on the coffee table between us. Julian, there's something I've never told you, I said softly. It wasn't because I didn't trust you, it was because I needed you to fall in love with me, with this soldier, with the person I am, and not with anything else. He looked at the folder, then at me, a question in his eyes. He opened it. I watched his face as he processed the information, the sequence of emotions playing out in his expression. Confusion, then utter shock. And then, as his eyes found the bottom line, I saw something else flicker across his face. A complex, undefinable look that settled on a faint hint of hurt. He looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Because in my world, I explained, my voice gentle but firm, you're judged by what you do, not by what you have. I needed to be seen as Captain Barnes, not as an heiress. The hurt in his eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a wave of deep and profound understanding. He closed the folder and pushed it aside, as if it were irrelevant. I get it, he breathed, a small sad smile touching his lips. I fell in love with a soldier, not a bank account. And with those words, the last wall between us crumbled into dust. The doubt, the fear, the anger. It all washed away, leaving only the solid ground of our commitment. We weren't just a couple in love anymore, we were a unit. I reached into my bag and pulled out the yellow legal pad from Marcus's office, the Articles of an Equal Partnership, sketched out in his confident hand. I gave it to Julian. He read the preamble, then the key clauses. I watched a genuine smile spread across his face for the first time since he'd arrived. A smile of relief, of recognition. This, he said, looking up at me, his eyes shining with a newfound strength. This is us, a team. He placed his hand over mine on the document, his grip firm and steady. Now, let's go show them what a real team looks like. The flight back to New York with Julian was a study in quiet solidarity. We weren't just a couple in love anymore. We were a single, unified front moving toward a clear objective. A two-person fire team preparing to enter hostile territory. Every decision we made was strategic. We booked a dinner meeting at the Capitol Grill in Midtown Manhattan, a den of dark wood, aged steak, and quiet power. A place where billion-dollar deals were made over $1,000 bottles of wine. It was neutral ground. We were not going to their estate, not stepping onto their turf where they held every advantage. This battle would be fought on our terms. We arrived 15 minutes early, a discipline ingrained in me from my military training. Punctuality is a form of control. I had chosen my uniform for this engagement carefully. A simple but impeccably tailored navy blue sheath dress. It was professional, understated, and powerful. Julian, in a sharp dark suit that fit him perfectly, looked every bit the Vance heir. But the cloud of hesitation that once shadowed his eyes was gone. In its place was a cold, hard determination that mirrored my own. We requested a corner booth, a power seat tucked away from the main flow of traffic that gave us a clear view of the entire dining room, including the entrance. We were in command of the space. When the waiter, a man in a crisp white jacket, approached our table, I didn't even glance at the wine list. Woodford Reserve, on the rocks, I said, my voice even. Julian ordered the same. It was a subtle but clear statement. We weren't here to socialize, to sip delicate Chardonnay. We were here to negotiate a treaty. Alistair and Genevieve arrived precisely on time, as they always did. They swept into the restaurant not like people arriving for dinner, but like monarchs making an entrance, expecting the low hum of conversation to dip in deference. They carried with them an aura of regal condescension, expecting to find two chastened children ready to beg for forgiveness. Genevieve's eyes landed on Julian and me, sitting side by side, a united front, and a smug, knowing smile touched her lips. Well, she purred, her voice a silken weapon as she slid into the booth opposite Julian. It seems you two have talked. I do hope you've managed to explain the realities of the world to her, Julian. It's for her own good, really. Alistair said nothing. He simply gave his son a curt, almost imperceptible nod of approval, as if Julian had successfully disciplined an unruly subordinate and was now presenting the results. They took their seats, arranging their napkins in their laps, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet had fundamentally shifted. They had come expecting a surrender. They were about to face a full-scale counteroffensive. Julian didn't wait for them to settle. He didn't allow for small talk. He launched the first strike, his voice steady and unwavering, cutting through their condescending act. Father, mother, he began, his tone formal and final. We're here tonight to inform you that your proposed contract is unacceptable. It isn't just unfair, it's an insult, and we will not sign it. Either we find a resolution tonight based on mutual respect, or there will be no wedding. The smugness on Genevieve's face froze, then cracked like a porcelain mask. I watched her eyes flicker with genuine surprise, which quickly hardened into anger. Alistair's gaze narrowed, his focus sharpening on his son like a laser. He was clearly blindsided, not by the sentiment, but by the united rebellion. "Julian, don't be naive," Alistair shot back, his voice taking on a hard, threatening edge. "This is how the world works. This is how legacies are protected." "No," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was quiet, yet it seemed to cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. "That is how your world works. In our world, we have something called honor." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 folders. I slid them across the polished dark wood of the table. They came to a stop directly in front of Alistair. One was the single-page document Marcus had drafted, our Articles of an Equal Partnership. The other was the simple manila folder containing my certified financial statement. "Before you read our proposal," I said, my eyes locked on Alistair, "I think you should look at this first. It will allow us to have a conversation based on a full disclosure of the facts." Genevieve reached for the manila folder with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated, a look of profound distaste on her face. But Alistair, ever the lawyer, ever the pragmatist, opened his immediately. I kept my own expression neutral, my training kicking in. I was an intelligence analyst observing a target, cataloging every micro-expression. I saw the flash of annoyance at our audacity. I saw it morph into confusion as he scanned the list of assets, diversified stocks, real estate holdings. And then, as he turned to the final page and his eyes hit the bottom line number, I saw it. The complete and utter demolition of his arrogant composure. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen under the restaurant's dim lighting. It was as if he'd been physically struck. His head snapped up, his eyes wide, locking onto mine. The superiority was gone, vaporized. In its place was a raw, uncomprehending disbelief. He was looking at me, truly looking at me, for the very first time. Genevieve, sensing the sudden, violent shift in her husband's demeanor, snatched the folder from his limp hands. I heard her sharp, incredulous intake of breath. Her perfectly lipsticked mouth fell open. All the sarcasm, all the condescension, all the carefully constructed superiority she wore like armor simply vanished. 9 million, she stammered, the words a choked whisper. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a shock that bordered on fear. "How?" "My grandfather was a good soldier," I stated, my voice flat and even. "He was an even better investor." Julian seized the tactical advantage. His voice, now resonating with a power and authority I'd never heard from him before, filled the stunned, cavernous silence. "Now," he said, pushing our 1-page proposal toward them with a decisive flick of his wrist. "Let's talk about our Articles of Partnership. They are non-negotiable. You have 24 hours to have your lawyers review it and sign." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes cold. "If you don't," he paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in, "I will personally call the New York Times and give them a very interesting story about how the Vance family treats a decorated officer of the United States Army." Alistair and Genevieve were completely silent. They just stared, first at the document, then at us. For the first time in their privileged lives, they were disarmed, outmaneuvered, and utterly silenced. The smug smiles were gone, replaced by the blank, stunned expressions of 2 monarchs who had just been checkmated by a pawn they never even saw coming. They were speechless. And honestly, seeing the shock on their faces was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. If you agree that some people need a serious reality check, hit that like button. And for my question tonight, just comment with the word checkmate if you were cheering for us in that moment. We stood up from the table, leaving them there amidst the ruins of their own arrogance. The battle was over. The war, however, was about to enter a new and uncertain phase. The 24 hours after our dinner at the Capitol Grill were thick with a tense, waiting silence. Julian and I didn't talk much about what might happen. We didn't need to. We just stayed together in a city apartment, a quiet, solid presence for one another. The battle had been fought. Now we were holding the line, waiting to see if the enemy would surrender or force us to deploy our final weapon, the call to the press. At precisely 5 p.m., an email pinged on my phone. It was from Marcus. The subject line was a single word: victory. I opened it. The message was brief and to the point, just like the man himself. Article signed, no revisions. Congratulations, Captain. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so strong it almost buckled my knees. I showed the phone to Julian, and he pulled me into a fierce hug, lifting me off the floor. We did it, he whispered into my hair. No, I corrected him, pulling back to look him in the eye. You did it. You chose to be my partner. The moment was sweet, a clear and decisive win. But it didn't feel like the pure elation of a total victory. It was more complicated than that. We had won the legal battle, but the collateral damage to our future family felt immense. Just as that thought crossed my mind, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. My stomach tightened. This is Genevieve, the message read. Can we meet? Alone, just the two of us. My first instinct was suspicion. Was this another trap? Another attempt to manipulate the situation? But the request was direct, without any of the usual flowery language she used. I agreed, suggesting a small independent coffee shop in Greenwich Village, a place far from her Upper East Side comfort zone. If she was serious, she would come to me. When she walked into the cafe the next afternoon, I almost didn't recognize her. The usual armor of designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair was gone. She wore simple slacks and a cashmere sweater. Her face looked tired, and for the first time, I saw the fine lines of vulnerability around her eyes. She carried none of her usual aristocratic air as she navigated the crowded room. She sat down opposite me, placing her handbag on the floor. And for a long moment, she just stared into the latte the waitress had placed in front of her. The silence stretched, but this time, it wasn't a weapon. It was hesitant, uncertain. Finally, she lifted her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were clear of the icy judgment I was used to. I was wrong, she said, her voice quiet and steady. I judged you based on my own prejudices. I was cruel, and I was unfair. There is no excuse for my behavior. She took a breath, and the next words seemed to cost her a great deal. I am sorry, Talia. The apology stunned me more than the $9 million revelation had stunned her. I had been prepared for more arguments, more threats, perhaps a more subtle form of manipulation. I was not prepared for a direct, unequivocal apology. As an intelligence officer, I'm trained to question everything, to look for the angle, the hidden motive. But as I watched her, I saw no deception in her eyes. I saw a woman who had been profoundly shaken, forced to look in a mirror she had been avoiding for years. I didn't know how to respond, so I just listened. You remind me of Julian's great-grandmother, Genevieve continued, a distant, thoughtful look on her face. Eleanor. She was a nurse in the First World War. She came from a family of farmers in Ohio. When she married into the Vance family, they all looked down on her. They thought she was common, that she wasn't good enough. She paused, taking a small sip of her coffee. But she was the strongest, smartest one of them all. She saved the family's entire fortune during the Great Depression with her shrewdness and common sense when all the men with their fancy educations were panicking. Genevieve reached into her handbag and pulled out a small velvet-covered box. It looked old. She left this, she said, her voice becoming thick with emotion. She stipulated in her will that it wasn't to be given to just any woman who married a Vance. It was to be given to a woman who would bring new strength to the family, not just more money. Her hands, which I noticed were trembling slightly, opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was an antique silver brooch. It was the image of an eagle, its wings outstretched in powerful flight. It wasn't flashy or covered in gems. It was simple, elegant, and radiated a sense of quiet, unyielding strength. It was beautiful. I think this belongs to you, she said, pushing the box across the table. I was so focused on protecting our old legacy that I forgot a legacy has to breathe. It needs new life to survive. You are that new life, Talia. Your strength is something we haven't had in a long time. I picked up the box. The weight of it felt significant in my hand. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was an olive branch, a peace treaty, a recognition that went far beyond any legal document. I knew my relationship with Genevieve would never be simple or easy. The scars were too deep for that. But for the very first time, I could see a path forward, a chance for something more than just a ceasefire. a chance for a real family. "Thank you, Genevieve," I said, my voice quiet. "I'll treasure it." Our wedding day dawned bright and clear, the late summer sun casting a golden glow over the vineyards of Long Island's North Fork. We didn't get married at the Vance estate in the Hamptons, a place that had become a symbol of conflict and judgment. Instead, we chose a beautiful, sprawling vineyard, a place that felt both elegant and grounded, a perfect fusion of our two worlds. This wasn't their event, it was ours. Every decision, from the flowers to the music, was made by Julian and me together. Early on, Genevieve had presented us with a preliminary guest list, a veritable who's who of East Coast politics and finance. Julian hadn't even hesitated. "No, Mom," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is our wedding. Talia's friends, the soldiers she has served with, the men and women who have had her back in some of the most dangerous places on earth, they are just as important as any senator on your list." And for the first time, Genevieve had simply smiled, a little sadly perhaps, and agreed. The stage was no longer hers to command. As the guests began to arrive, the beautiful harmony of our two lives played out before my eyes. On one side of the lawn, under a magnificent old oak tree, were the Vance's guests, men in Tom Ford suits and women in Chanel dresses discussing stock portfolios and summer travel plans. On the other side were my guests, my family from North Carolina and my friends from the military, standing tall and proud in their dress uniforms, sharing stories of deployments and life on base. My best friend, Maya Ray Reyes, looking stunning and formidable in her Air Force mess dress, quickly became the center of attention. I watched, a smile spreading across my face, as she stood engaged in a lively conversation with one of Alistair's oldest law partners, a notoriously gruff man in his 70s. They were both laughing, completely engrossed. In that moment, I saw more than just a polite mingling of guests. I saw a bridge being built, a sturdy, hopeful structure spanning the chasm between our two seemingly irreconcilable worlds. For the first part of the ceremony, I chose not to wear a traditional wedding gown. Instead, I wore my Army service uniform, the crisp white shirt and dark blue jacket that represented so much of who I was. Pinned carefully to the lapel was the antique silver eagle brooch, Eleanor Vance's legacy, a silent testament to the peace we had forged. When the music began and I started my walk down the aisle, I saw Julian waiting for me under an archway of white roses. The look in his eyes held everything: love, respect, admiration, and a profound understanding of the journey we had taken to get to this moment. When I reached him, he didn't just take my hand. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod of respect, a soldier acknowledging his partner. We had written our own vows, words that spoke not just of love, but of alliance. "I promise," I said, my voice thick with emotion but steady, "to be your compass when you are lost, and your fortress when the storms come." He squeezed my hand, his own voice clear and strong. "And I promise," he answered, "to be the sentinel of your heart, the one who will never, ever leave you behind on the battlefield of life." We weren't just exchanging rings. We were forming an unbreakable alliance. As the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, we turned to walk back down the aisle, and I was met with a surprise Julian had arranged. My military friends had formed a traditional saber arch, their polished swords gleaming in the afternoon sun, creating a vaulted ceiling for us to pass under. It was a beautiful, powerful symbol, a formal welcome for Julian into my world, my family of choice. Later, at the reception, held in a beautifully restored barn lit by hundreds of fairy lights, it was time for the toasts. I steeled myself for Alistair's speech, expecting a few polite, hollow platitudes. But he surprised me. He stood, raised his glass of champagne, and waited for the room to fall silent. "When I first met Talia," he began, his voice deep and contemplative, "I saw an officer, a capable, disciplined young woman. Today," he paused, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room, "I see a brilliant strategist, a woman of iron will, and a deeply compassionate heart." He let that sink in before continuing. "Our great-grandmother Eleanor used to say that the Vance family needed new blood to survive, to keep from growing stagnant and complacent. Talia, he said, raising his glass higher, welcome to the family. You are not just marrying into it, you are strengthening it. It was the final, unconditional surrender. Not a signature on a contract, but a public declaration, an admission of her value and his own misjudgment. In that moment, with the warm glow of the lights around us and Julian's hands securely in mine, I knew the war was truly over. Looking at my new husband, and then at the incredible, unlikely mix of people all celebrating together, I realized what family truly was. It wasn't about bloodlines or shared last names. It was about loyalty. It was about choosing to stand by someone, to fight for them. It was about respect. My family wasn't just the one I was born into, or the one I had just married into. It was this. All of this. A coalition of honor, built on a foundation of love. After the wedding, after the honeymoon, after the dust from our war had finally settled, Julian and I began the most important mission of all: building a life. We didn't move into a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, as the Vances had quietly assumed we would. Instead, we made a deliberate choice to draw our own map. We bought a cozy 2-story brick colonial in Alexandria, Virginia. It was close enough to Washington, D.C. for my career in intelligence and for Julian's new job at a nonprofit advocating for veterans. But it was just far enough from New York to give us breathing room. It had a small, manageable garden, hardwood floors that creaked with character, and a fireplace that crackled with the promise of quiet evenings. It was our fortress, our home. We established our own rules of engagement for our marriage from day one. All major decisions made together, no financial secrets, and an unbreakable rule that his family and my family were not to interfere in a conflict between the two of us. We were a sovereign nation of two. Genevieve's first visit was a test of those new borders. She walked into our home, her eyes scanning our simple, functional kitchen. We didn't have a Sub-Zero refrigerator or a 6-burner Wolf range. We had a GE profile and countertops we'd installed ourselves. "Oh," she said, a faint wrinkle of distaste appearing on her brow. "It's all very rustic." It was the ghost of her old self, a subtle jab wrapped in a polite word. A year ago, it might have wounded me. Now, it just felt predictable. Before I could even respond, Julian, who was standing beside me, gently squeezed my hand. "It is, Mom," he said, his voice warm but firm. "It's ours, and we love it." He didn't argue, he didn't get defensive, he simply stated a fact and, in doing so, gently but unequivocally drew a line. "This is our space. Your standards do not apply here." The next test came a few weeks later. The Vance family had a sacred tradition: mandatory Sunday dinner at the estate. No exceptions. On the second Sunday after our honeymoon, Julian's phone rang. It was his mother. I could hear her imperious tone even from across the room. "Julian, darling, where are you two? Cook is holding dinner." "We're still unpacking, Mom," Julian said calmly. "We're planning to come up next Sunday." There was a pause. "No, Julian. That won't do," she insisted. "It's tradition." I watched him. He took a slow, deep breath, the way a soldier does before entering a tense situation. "Mom, we love you," he said, his voice laced with an unshakable resolve. "But Talia and I have our own life now. We'll do our best to come up twice a month. But that's what we can manage. We're creating our own traditions now." He listened for another moment, said, "I love you too," and hung up. He turned to me with a wry smile and a slight shrug. "Well," he said, "I expect we'll feel some aftershocks from that one." And in that moment, I felt a wave of love for him that was deeper than anything I had ever felt before. It was the profound, grounding security of knowing your partner will stand with you, that he will protect the life you are building together, even when it's hard. He had become the sentinel he promised he would be. But the most surprising development came a few months later, on a quiet Tuesday evening. My phone rang with a call from a number I recognized with a start. Alistair Vance's private line. I braced myself, expecting some new legal maneuver or complaint. There were no pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "Talia," he said, his voice all business. I'm looking at a potential investment in a new defense technology firm. I recall you mentioning you did sector analysis in that field. I want your professional opinion. As an expert, not as my daughter-in-law. I was floored. He wasn't calling to challenge me. He was calling for my help. For the next hour, we talked. I broke down the company's technology, their market position, the potential risks in their supply chain, and the geopolitical factors he hadn't considered. I was direct, professional, and uncompromising in my analysis. I gave him the same unvarnished truth I would give a commanding general. When I was done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought I had overstepped. Then his voice came back, devoid of its usual arrogance. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your assessment was valuable." That was it. But it was everything. It was a recognition of my worth based on my skills and my intellect. The respect I had fought for wasn't just a grudging concession made under duress. It was real. That night, I told Julian about the call as we sat by the fire, a glass of wine in my hand. He just smiled, a look of deep pride on his face. "See?" he said softly. "You didn't just marry into my family, Talia. You're changing it." We sat there in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the flames dance. The peace we felt wasn't the absence of conflict. We knew there would be more challenges, more negotiations, more small battles to be fought along the way. But this was a new kind of peace. It was the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can face any storm, navigate any terrain, as long as you have your partner by your side. We had fought for this peace, and it was sweeter than any victory I had ever known. 2 years passed. 2 years of building a life in our quiet corner of Virginia, of finding a rhythm that was uniquely ours. I was still serving, my work in intelligence as demanding and fulfilling as ever. And Julian had found his true calling, leaving the corporate law world far behind to work for a nonprofit that provided legal and financial support to veterans transitioning back to civilian life. He was happier than I had ever seen him, his work fueled by a quiet passion to serve those who had served. One evening, we were sitting in our small study, paying bills and reviewing our finances, just like any other married couple. I was looking at the quarterly statement from the portfolio my grandfather had left me. The numbers on the page were impressive, but they also felt abstract, impersonal. "You know," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "we have more than we will ever need. I want this money to mean something more. I want it to do something." Julian looked up from his laptop, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. He leaned back in his chair. "Do you remember that first day at the estate? What my mother said about your pension?" A shadow of the memory, the sting of the insult, passed through me. I nodded. "What if we did the exact opposite of that?" he proposed, a new energy lighting up his eyes. "What if we use Avant's legacy, their shrewdness with money, to honor the values of the Barnes family?" And just like that, an idea was born. Not from anger or desire for revenge, but from a place of peace and a shared desire to create something positive from the ashes of our conflict. We decided to establish a scholarship fund. We didn't want to fund a trust fund kids on their way to the Ivy League. The world had enough of that. Our scholarship would be for the children of enlisted service members and veterans. Bright, talented young people who wanted to pursue careers in public service, education, nursing, social work, law enforcement. The quiet heroes who hold the fabric of our nation together. It became our shared project, a perfect fusion of our skills and our worlds. Julian, with his legal expertise, handled the complex paperwork of establishing a charitable foundation. I, with my network throughout the military community, worked to find the most deserving candidates. We named it the Barnes-Vance Legacy Scholarship. The name was a statement in itself, a symbol of the bridge we had built, of the reconciliation of two families, two value systems, into a single, stronger entity. The first award ceremony was held not in a flashy hotel ballroom, but in the magnificent, awe-inspiring Great Hall of the Library of Congress's Thomas Jefferson Building in Washington, D.C. The setting was intentional, a place of knowledge, of national heritage, a place that belonged to every American. Alistair and Genevieve were there. They flew down from New York for the event and sat in the front row. They had changed in the past 2 years. The hard edges of their arrogance had softened. As they looked around the historic hall, at the bright young faces of the scholarship recipients, I saw something in their eyes I had never seen before, a quiet, genuine pride. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and looked out at the audience, at the hopeful students, their proud parents in and out of uniform, and at my 2 families, now united. My family taught me that honor can't be bought, I began, my voice clear and steady. It must be earned through service and sacrifice. And my husband's family taught me that a legacy, to endure, must be invested wisely. I smiled, looking from my father to Alistair. Today, we are combining those 2 lessons. We are investing in the most valuable legacy of all, the future of young Americans dedicated to serving others. We are investing in you. After the ceremony, as people mingled over coffee and pastries, a young woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a shy smile approached me. "Captain Barnes," she said. "I'm Sarah. My dad is a sergeant first class with the 101st Airborne. I just wanted to thank you. Because of this scholarship, I can afford to go to nursing school. You're my hero." Looking into her shining eyes, I felt a sense of clarity so profound it was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long and violent storm. My personal war with the Vances, a conflict that had felt so all-consuming, so painful at the time, was never just about me. It was a necessary crucible, a trial by fire that had forged us all, me, Julian, even his parents, into something stronger, something better. It had cleared the way for this moment, for this self-made dawn. I reached for Julian's hand, my fingers lacing through his. We hadn't just built a marriage. We had, against all odds, built a legacy. A legacy defined not by the cold, hard numbers in a bank account or by a storied family name, but by the quiet, enduring power of honor, by the strength of integrity, and by the simple, profound act of giving someone else a chance. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. Looking at that young woman, Sarah, I finally understood the most important lesson from this entire ordeal. My grandfather taught me that no one else gets to decide your value, and my in-laws put that lesson to the ultimate test. They tried to put a price tag on my honor, on my service. They failed because my worth was never up for their negotiation, and neither is yours. Our journey together doesn't have to end here. If you believe in stories where integrity is the only currency that matters, you've found your community. Please subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own unshakable worth. Thank you for listening.